Clarissa Rogers, dear friend, rest in peace. Clarissa was a working-class intellectual, a self-made political theorist. She will be so missed. Her memorial is in just a few days. She contributed so much to the activist community in Philadelphia. She loved puns. She loved good food. And she made the city a home for so many people. I first met Clarissa in 2003 when we were both co-facilitating these large citywide coalitions against war. And we became friends very quickly. We became very aware that we were both really interested in self-education. My own story, I left school in 5th grade and I continued teaching myself from then on. And she was always very interested in this and asked a lot of questions. Her particular interest in self-education was in worker self-education, and this idea of pedagogy, of self-learning as a way of challenging structures of social oppression against racism and against the social economic hierarchy. She was remarkable in that she was very interested in meeting and finding working class intellectuals. She read Gramsci, but she was inspired to try to put that in practice. So, where Gramsci talks about traditional intellectuals who are interested in poetry, philosophy, interested in novel writing, Clarissa really was curious about the working class equivalent of this. And she found and met friends and was really wanting to see how can we find our friends whose ideas and whose thinking is the most likely to be lost to history. Just as the wealthy and the most educated are perhaps the most likely to be remembered by history. She saw it almost as a kind of archaeology of rescuing what's about to be lost from oblivion. At the time, Clarissa and I were trying to teach ourselves journalism, and we were interested in working class journalism. And Clarissa had kind of an amazing idea. She was curious, how can we put together our facilitation work with journalism? What if, in the same way that when we facilitate group meetings, we try to invite friends who have not spoken yet into the conversation and into participation? She wondered, can we do that with journalism? Since we were teaching ourselves how to interview people and turn those into articles, what if we asked questions that were able to frame the answer into an opening sentence, an opening paragraph, and the work in the middle, and then in the same way at the end into a grand finish? I think Clarissa came onto this pretty incredible idea, and when she did, we talked a lot about this. She pointed out that so many people in our culture say that everyone has a book in them. But when we say this, we're usually talking about local characters. And when we talk about local characters in this way, there's not much commitment in our culture to actually want to hear that story, the wisdom in that life story, or the knowledge or the thinking in it. And there's not really a commitment to see if we can try to preserve and record and find ourselves able to learn from what is an unspoken and invisible voice in our society. Clarissa, she pointed out also that, of course, there are many blue-collar and pink-collar workers who are, fine in terms of getting our ideas onto paper, into article form, into book form, but there are so many others to whom putting our ideas into article form would feel like an insurmountable task. So this is another place where Clarissa's idea really opened up possibilities. We tried this out with some of our friends. One of them, Greg McGee, who loves movies and loves films. He was interested in documentaries on YouTube about soldiers and PTSD. And his thinking about this was that there has to be a political context to everything he watches on YouTube. And he would do what we would ask him questions, and then he would call right back on voicemail, and he would leave his his answers on the voicemail in such a way that it created an opening paragraph, and the middle, and the ending conclusion. And then when we made up a transcript, we just took our questions out and brought it to Greg, for Greg to polish up in the way that he wanted to. And it was kind of amazing. He had articles for the first time that he could give out to his friends. Look at what I think about these movies, about soldiers and PTSD that have no political context, and yet they have so much. Another example is my friend Brenda Leese. Brenda Leese learned all her poetry from song lyrics. And then for some reason inside of her, she became interested in making that style of poetry more and more symbolic and more metaphorical, until her poetry just became strings of metaphors that could be read in different ways. And again, this is completely on her own that she arrived in this, in isolation from the classical poetry tradition and French symbolist poetry and things like this. We interviewed her, an article came out where she was talking about her own life and how she arrived at this way of writing poetry, her own life experiences, gender violence in her family that is expressed in these poems. And it was remarkable for her to have an article where she's able to talk about her work to a reading audience. Another example is our friend Lionel. And Lionel grew up in an incredibly difficult neighborhood, and his high school was a war zone. He survived his high school, but he survived in part by falling in love with astronomy. And he learned the constellations. He sought out every opportunity he could to look through telescopes and observatories. He made friends with professors at Penn and asked questions about the theory of relativity. His article was able to bring together his interest in the Greek myths and how the Greek myths interconnect with the history of the constellations. And he was bringing out very profound philosophical questions from the names of the constellations and asking ourselves, what does this say about our own lives? What does this say about how we feel when we look out into the vast heavens? Clarissa and I were pretty excited about our successes. Even though they were published in small publications, which we put out, Clarissa was an editor, and she did an amazing job of making this happen. Clarissa herself, 2 years ago, due to long COVID and due to the health inequality of our medical system, she fell into a coma. And when she awoke, she forgot all her memories, almost all. She had some memory of who I was. She had talked to the nurses trying to describe me, and we were able to find where she was. This part of her life was pretty remarkable because she was reconstructing what her life was as she remembered more and more from Facebook, from other external sources, from talking to us. She was writing what she described as a mystery novel of her own life, where eerily she was the main character. And when she looked over past projects that we've done together, she came across these articles, and she didn't remember anything about them, and thought, so we used our facilitation and our working class journalism, and we brought out articles and books that otherwise wouldn't have been read. Said, this is a pretty amazing idea. And that was so good, because knowing Clarissa, she probably could appreciate how brilliant it was because she couldn't remember doing it. She had a sense of wonderment at what she'd accomplished that maybe was only possible through this. So I think, Clarissa, your memorial is in only a few days, and all your work will be remembered. I think this archaeology project of rescuing working class thinkers' ideas from oblivion will live on. Clarissa has a legacy, and she calls us to continue this legacy of honoring the working class thinkers whose thoughts are bypassed every day, and finding new ways to invite their own words to illuminate the page. Thank you.